Hello. I would like to do two things in this little video. Number one, I want to do a review of the paper that I had asked you to take a look at last week. And then number two, I want to give you some ideas to think about as you begin drafting your own paper. First, let's review the work that I had given you last week. Last week I gave you a paper and I asked for you to examine the paper and to look at it with regard specifically to how the student had organized his ideas. And I was really impressed with the ideas that you guys jotted down in your writing journal. And so I just want to cover some of them so that you have a strong understanding of what I'll be looking for as you start to draft your paper for this week. One of the really cool ideas that a lot of people mentioned is that you saw in the project from last week in the paper, you saw that the last paragraph here at the very end of the paper, this paragraph right here, actually served as the thesis. And so in a sense, you saw that the paper was put together upside down. That rather than start with the thesis, the student ended with the thesis. And specifically, the student ended with a series of claims. And so really this last paragraph is just a series of logically related claims. And each of those claims comes about as a result of the research that the student did in the paragraphs that came above. And so the idea is that had I asked the student to think of a thesis in advance, it's unlikely that that student would have been able to think of such a complex thesis. Instead, the student went into the project with questions, did some research, then wrote, then thought about the questions that that writing produced and did some research, so on and so forth. And so we really get the exploration of a topic. And if we can go back, that's really what I'm looking for in your work, is I want to see that your paper has this explorative tone, that really you're asking questions and looking at how the artifact that you have chosen unveils a complicated story. And so we can see that in the paper from last week, and we can also see that specifically with regard to the paragraphs, what the student has done is the student has introduced research in one paragraph, and then in the next paragraph, the student has applied that research to the artifact. And occasionally it happens in the same paragraph, but the idea is that the paragraphs are front-loaded with research and then there's application. So it's as if you have a question, you find out what the research says, and you apply the response to your artifact. And now, must you guys organize your paper like that? You don't necessarily need to organize it as this student did with regard to putting the questions into the paper, right? Like what is going to lead to. I don't necessarily need that, but I do want that overall explorative frame. And so there are students that put the final papers together in other ways. I have an example here where the student chose the artifact of the cemetery, and the student did all of this research, and so finally when the student put the project together, the student actually created subheadings that demonstrated the relationships that the student had found in the research. And so there's cemeteries as reminders of death as permanent, and then later on in the paper, from cemeteries to cremation, from permanence to impermanence, so on and so forth. And so there aren't these leading questions, but there are these subheadings that help organize the information. And also this student actually decided to put that thesis at the very beginning of the paper, which is absolutely fair. And the reason that I wanted to give you an example where it was at the end is because I wanted you guys to see that the whole point of the thesis is that it should be complex and that it comes as a result of doing the research. Where you decide to put it in your final product is up to you. So I hope that that gives you a good overall understanding of what I'm looking for in the paper. And so now specifically, with regard to the project that you'll be drafting and starting to draft this week, I want you guys to think about the logical relationships between the various research that you come across. And so what I've done is I've created a document that has example thesis statements from previous projects. And I ask that you read through this document, and as you read through it, I want you to start to highlight in your mind all of those logical relationships that exist in the thesis statements, because I think that that'll give you a good understanding of how you can then pursue your own project. And so for this week, one thing I'm asking you to do is to investigate these thesis statements. I also want to remind you that when you do this project, I am not asking that all of your research necessarily include your artifact. Now think about that for a sec. If you guys hop onto Google or if you go onto JSTOR or any of the databases, usually you end up writing the artifact and then you end up searching the information about the artifact. But one really interesting thing about this assignment is that there are some ideas that you are going to come to that aren't really about the artifact specifically, but they're ideas that you can apply to the artifact. So to give you a very specific example from this project that you looked at last week, in this project here, there's a point in the paper where the student starts to talk about distraction. And so the student was thinking about research on distraction. The student at that point wasn't thinking of Netflix, the student was thinking of distraction. And so the student came across research and saw that he could make the connection. So the student brought in the research on distraction, and then that student applied it to the cultural artifact of Netflix. And so as you do your research, consider that. Not all your research should be about the smartphone or the pill, right? Or whatever artifact you've chosen. You may have concepts in mind that you will relate. And that's really what makes these projects complex and interesting. I hope this helps. If you have questions, let me know.